Okay, in this lesson we're talking about moving to the Great Plains. Now, during the 1800s, large numbers of settlers moved onto the Great Plains and started farming. Now, there's going to be lots of reasons for this. We have just learned about the Civil War and how life was for African Americans. And as you can imagine, as we learned in a previous lesson about the Civil War, if you were an African American during this time, you wouldn't want to stay in the South either. So many people are going to find reasons for moving to the Great Plains. Well, where are the Great Plains? First, we need to identify where the Great Plains are located. The Great Plains are located in the middle of the United States, between the Rocky Mountains in the west and the Mississippi River in the east. All right, so the Great Plains are those states that if you're looking at a map of the United States, you'll see the Rocky Mountains on the west, and you'll see the Mississippi River on the east. Those states located in between, or the heartland of our country, is the Great Plains area. So that's where those are located. Now, why did these people start moving to the Great Plains? Well, your book explains that for the early settlers that moved out west, they chose to skip the Great Plains area. To them, the early settlers called that the Great Desert. Now, the reason they called it that was because it's a wide, flat region. Between the Rockies and the Mississippi River was a wide, flat region with very little vegetation. And so, if you look up the definition of a desert, you learn that a desert is a dry place with little vegetation. Well, so the first settlers that came through there, they just kind of kept on going. They didn't realize this is a great place to live, and so they were looking for a reason to just bypass that. They were more interested in heading out west to where gold was discovered. But in 1862, Congress passes what's called the Homestead Act. Settlers were offered 160 acres of land for a small fee and had to live there for 5 years. Right? So this is going to be an automatic attention getter. Many people lived in the east, in big cities. Those big cities are starting to get kind of crowded. It's horrible conditions, and so many of these settlers are looking for a new place to go to. They want lots of land, and so this 160 acres for a small fee, and all we have to do is live there for 5 years. Man, sign me up. And so many of these settlers are going to do this. Farmers from the eastern United States moved to this area for farmland. Many of the good farmland in this area in the east had already been taken up, and it was very expensive. And so many of the farmers in the east that wanted to be farmers chose to move out onto the Great Plains because, number one, it's a larger area, and number two, it's cheap farmland. Many European farmers wanted to farm large areas as well. And so many people from Europe also, from England, Ireland, Scotland, those places like that, many of them could not afford large farm areas, but they saw the advertisements in their countries that said, come to America and you can live on 160 acres of land for a small fee if you live there 5 years. And so many European farmers are interested in this as well. So what we start to see is a large increase in the population of people living in the middle part of our country. Now, I got a review question for you. Why did settlers from Europe and the East move to the Great Plains? I'll give you just a few minutes to think about that. Okay, the next group that we're going to talk about are the exodusters. Now, as I mentioned earlier, during the early 1800s, during the time of the Civil War, and before that, many African Americans that were living in the South were slaves. Now, of course, slavery is a horrible lifestyle to live in, and many of the African Americans, I'm sure, were looking for ways to get out of this. Well, after the war is over and after Reconstruction has finished in the 1870s, African Americans in the South found it still a very difficult place to live, and so they were looking for some place where they could go. And we're going to learn about this. It says after Reconstruction ended, or let me back up, African Americans in the South also wanted to start farms on the Great Plains. After Reconstruction ended in 1870s, life was difficult for African Americans in the South. Now, oftentimes they were going to be mistreated. There's prejudice towards them. That means if a black man and a white man want the same job, they're going to hire the white man first. Black people are not going to make as much money. And so, this is not the kind of lifestyle anybody would like to live. A man by the name of Benjamin Pat Singleton was an African American who moved up to the area of Kansas. He liked this area so much, and he came up with this idea that African Americans in the South should move to this area. So he prints up advertisements for African Americans to leave the South and to move to Kansas, and they start to move out by the thousands. Now, for those that are living on the Great Plains, they have to face many hardships. A hardship is a difficulty. Okay, many of these settlers, when they first got here, they quickly learned that this move to the Great Plains was a mistake. They thought this, we get 160 acres of land for cheap. This is going to be great. We can move out there, start our family. It's going to be wonderful. They get here and they got there and they soon realized that the climate was terrible. For example, the winters were long and bitterly cold. I'm talking freezing cold. Temperatures would often drop 40 degrees below zero. Summer times were no better. Summer times they were hot and dry, and droughts were common. Now, a drought is a long, extended period of time without rain. And when the rains did come and the grains and the ground was dry, the settlers would worry about prairie fires. Now, prairie fires could be caused by if somebody started a small fire and an ember blows and catches grass next to it on fire, then the whole place is going to go. But more than likely, prairie fires were started by lightning strikes. Now, when these prairie fires started, there was no way to put them out. Water was very scarce in this area. They didn't have a fire department that they could call. They didn't have 911 that they could call. It's just pretty much you let it burn until it either rains or it runs out of things to burn, and this is very, very dangerous. Many settlers, they couldn't get their crops to grow. Their tools that they used were, they would try to dig into the ground, and it would bend their shovel, or it would bend whatever tool it was that they were using, or break them. The plows that they had didn't work. They weren't tough enough because that soil there is very thick. So many settlers said, hey, the heck with this, we're going back home. Some of the European farmers go back home. They said, at least we know where we came from and know how to survive there. This is terrible. But some are going to choose to stay. Now, settlers that did decide to stay learned how to adapt to the plains. All right, it says, despite the hardships, many settlers learned to adapt to their new environment or new life. Settlers learned how to bust the sod. These people are called sod busters. They created tools that could cut into this thick soil. They used this thick soil and with the grass roots in it, and they built homes from it, sod homes. And they grew new wheat from Europe. European farmers brought with them new types of wheat that grew in Europe, and so they started planting that on the Great Plains. And this wheat from Europe did very well. Now, the sod houses or sod homes were not very nice houses. If you could imagine what it would be like to live in a home made with mud bricks. When it does rain, it's going to leak. Funny stories you can read about this talk about how cattle would be, they'd build them into these houses into the side of hills. And the cattle would be walking along grazing and eating on top of the hill, just walk right out onto the roof and fall right through. Many people talk about going to bed and a snake comes through the wall, or rats or bugs or things. That wouldn't be much fun. But they decide to stay there. After developing new machines such as the plow, planters, and reapers, and thrashers, farming becomes a lot easier. Okay, so these folks had decided, we're going to stay here and tough it out. They learn to create new machinery that helps them adapt. Final review question. How did the settlers adapt to life on the Great Plains? Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this lesson.